Just so you know, there are translations of Rumi that aren't endorsed by Deepak Chopra or something like that. He seems to have become an icon of the New Age, but it's 13th century Sufi poet and mystic. Sufism is obviously the sort of mystical strand of Islam. And just start by reading the poem and then just offer a few brief remarks about how this might shape the next few hours we're spending together, wasting time graciously, gracefully with God and each other. So the guest house. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Okay, thanks, Holly. So, one of the things that's interesting about doing quiet days on a regular basis is that it's very much like Forrest Gump said, you know, quiet day is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. That not knowing is part of our learning and something that we learn to open into and embrace, right? The temptation, I think, is to approach silent prayer with a subtle set of expectations, spoken or unspoken. They're sort of like the hidden reef that is just under the surface of our practice, right? And we all bring certain expectations. And when you hear something called a quiet day, you're like, oh, well, that means my mind's going to be quiet. And my children aren't going to be outside the window screaming, you know, or whatever. Or the neighbor's not going to be using his leaf blower for 4 hours straight, the exact same time that you're doing a quiet day. We think that prayer in that way is a means to an end, right? And the means is whatever technique we're employing, and the end is peace, quiet, bliss. You know, Teresa of Avila collapsed in ecstasy by Bernini, whatever our picture is. And that's really, as I was saying, like kind of a means end way of approaching what we're up to in prayer. We pray in order to, right? Rather than to simply welcome whatever comes. Rumi says to welcome, you know, be grateful. But sometimes I would just be happy to be tolerant of whoever or whatever comes, right? I mean, start with tolerance, start with not chasing whatever arises back out the door, right? And then we can be grateful and greet them laughing, in about 30 years. But at least drop the expectation that prayer is supposed to be a certain way, right? And conform to our little idea of what peace is, right? Not my will, but thy will be done, right? So I think it's important to see our time of silent prayer as really a practice of welcoming, yes. Another way to say that would be loving attention, loving awareness to whatever happens to show up, right? Very important for our prayer not to be a means of control or manipulation or the application of some kind of technique to achieve some desired result, right? A kind of curating of our inner experience. Because when you get right down to it, snipping and prettying up the picture and making our minds the way we think they should be, pushing away feelings we don't want to have. When you get right down to it, that is a form of violence. It's a form of violence towards ourselves. And it's really an expression of self-hate. Our gospel for today, Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, of course. And immediately after that, he's betrayed by Judas, right? It's interesting that Jesus even welcomes, embraces the one who will betray him, the one who will be the catalyst for sending him to his death, right? Interesting that into that garden where Jesus is, that even Judas is allowed, is welcome, seen, named, right? Kissed, and not without a little bit of irony. Oh, so this is how it's going to go, Judas? Okay, but still welcomed. And when the disciples want to chase these so-called unwelcome folks out of the garden, grab a sword, right? Lop off somebody's ear. Jesus says, no more of this. And that's the sort of the mission statement for a quiet day. No more of that kind of pushing away violence towards ourselves. No more of that, right? We're not lopping off ears, but, there's things we push away. If I actually see that and embrace it, it's going to say horrible things about myself and my self-image. I'm supposed to be calm and peaceful, and yet I'm raging away at my neighbor in my head or whatever it is, right? So that way of nonviolence towards ourselves is of paramount importance, right? And paired with that is the recognition that the peace that we seek, that we yearn for, and for which we're made, is not something that we have to attain. It's not something that's given to us after we have quieted our mind, right? It's who we are. It's not something we have to make an effort to achieve or attain. It's not a reward in the distant future that comes as a result of some heroic ascetical feat of endurance or whatever. Peace is given here and now, right? It is finished, it is accomplished. And so Jesus is not joking around when he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." See, in our self-improvement culture, it's easy to turn the way of silent prayer into yet another work, another technique we apply to get a desired result. And that just keeps us trapped in the very thing that makes us miserable. So what is that yoke? The yoke of ease and rest that Jesus asks us to take on. I think it's learning, like that Palestinian teenager in an unknown corner of the world, Mary. It's learning to let it be, to let everything be as it is. Not my will, but your will be done. Let it be with me according to your word. That means a joy. That means a depression. That means a meanness, a dark thought, a shame, a malice. We let everything come, right? And just allow it to reveal itself, to show its face, and then to let it go when it goes. You've all been practicing silent prayer before for a while now. But one little thing you might want to play with in some parts of maybe in the last parts of the different time sitting periods, is to, for 5 or 10 minutes, just drop whatever technique that you use to center and ground and calm yourself. So if it's the breath, what happens when you just let go of the breath and just open to the openness? If it's a prayer word, see what happens if you drop the use of the prayer word and just open. mantra, or whatever it is. And just see what being in that open space, letting things be just as they are, reveals, right? Because prayer is always headed towards that state of totally surrendered, childlike simplicity. It's no mistake that Jesus sent the disciples out without a bag of food, without sandals, no second cloak, no money. So what is that place in your prayer? No supports. Except, of course, the only support that really matters. See, I think when we get to this place of pushing out into the deeper waters, and we start to relax our use of whatever technique that we're using, we discover that prayer is very much like just looking in a mirror. When you sit down, or I guess you don't really ever sit down to look in the mirror. When you lean over and the bathroom sink and you look in the mirror, your face automatically appears, right? You can't do looking in the mirror well or badly, right? The mirror just shows us what's there. It's in the morning, it's the hair's a mess and your big bags under your eyes or whatever it is, right? And that's really what our time of silent prayer is. It's just sitting down and seeing what shows up in the mirror of our awareness and our attention. Now, if you're like me, when you look in the mirror, you say, God, you're losing what little hair you had. Or, your nose is as pointy as ever. Or, have you ever considered trimming your eyebrows or whatever, So we take what's there and then we add these subtle judgments, right? And we do that in silent prayer, right? Something will come up. Oh, I shouldn't be thinking this. I shouldn't be feeling this, right? And we judge what comes up, right? And that judgment is, I think, the most important thing to see when we're sitting in silence, because that judgment is actually the thing that causes the most suffering in our lives. The endless running ourselves down, judgment, subtle or not so subtle forms of self-hate, wanting to take a sword to whatever it is and chop off its ear. No more of this, right? So, don't judge yourself for judging, but just notice if there's the experience, and then there's the way in which we judge it. Right? And when you notice that, just see if you can soften and just, again, open to love, right? And just to allow whatever's there to be there. Sky doesn't try to chase clouds away. Right? See, the peace that passes all understanding is a peace that comes from the very same welcome that Rumi is calling us to. Peace that passes understanding is not the result of some kind of prayer technique. On a Saturday morning, peace that passes understanding is available to us when we have a terrible headache and our body feels like it's been put in a vice. And it's available to us when we're out for a walk, when somebody is sick. It's not dependent on circumstances, right? It's a willingness to be with what is in love, regardless of content. And again, that's why this is so important in your daily practice, just to practice softening, tolerating, and eventually welcoming and being grateful for whatever it is that arises in our experience. You practice with the little aches and pains, right? And then when, as I've been saying, the 800-pound gorilla shows up at our door, we're a little bit more willing not to immediately grab the sword, but to soften, to tolerate, welcome, because God is in that too, right? The very strange thing is the things that we resist persist in our lives, right? And when we learn to open to the thing that we've been resisting, we discover a new freedom that comes from embracing the thing that we've been avoiding, sometimes our whole life. That's why Rumi says, welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The people who know this are people who've struggled with addictions, If you go to an AA meeting or talk to somebody who's been in AA, the thing they always say is that, my addiction just about killed me. It caused all sorts of havoc, brought suffering to myself and others. And yet, I am so grateful for it, because without that, I would never have the kind of freedom and peace and gratitude that I now experience, right? So the very thing that was the affliction became the source of true freedom and love, service to others. Since Community of Hope is here, let me just see how, okay. Rumi's guest house poem should sound a lot like the porter, right, in the Rule of Benedict. The porter's role in the monastery is to sleep by the door, and whenever somebody knocks, to open the door and see that person as Christ, to welcome them. And that's why you have that Benedictine joke that when somebody shows up at your door, you open it and say, "Oh, Christ, it's you again," right? But again, so Benedict, you can spend a long time reading the Rule of Benedict and say, oh, okay, so when I open the door, I need to be nice to that person, at least, seek and serve Christ in them. Okay, but at least be nice when I'm opening the door, when I'm at work or at home. But I mean, clearly, Benedict is also talking about the very same thing that Rumi is talking about, is when some experience shows up at the door in our time of silence, what does it mean to see Christ in that experience, right? So the porter has an inner and outer dimension, obviously. It's not just telling you how to be a good Benedictine bellhop. It's telling you how to love yourself as God already loves you. So, one of the things that can be helpful if you have difficulty welcoming, which means that you're a human being, I think. There's those times when things are sailing along smoothly and all that, but when they're not, a helpful thing can be to notice the thoughts that are generating the sense of dis-ease, right? The sense of things being off kilter. So it could be feeling like, oh, I should have done that better, or you're worrying about what you're going to do next, or ruminating over a problem in your life. Instead of bracing against that, or bringing your attention back to the breath, concentrate, right? Which is really a form of grabbing a sword. See if you can just soften around that experience of worry, fear, irritation, anger. Notice it. Try to tolerate it, if not welcome it, right? And then notice the corresponding thing in your body. Every emotion has a bodily correlate. And often our bodies will tell us what's going on with us well in advance of us cluing in our head. If my shoulders get tight, something has gone wrong 5 minutes ago that my brain is catching up with, right? And then just welcome and experience those sensations in the body directly, not thinking about them, just resting as the sensations. And then when that seems to have run its course, you can, resume your regular practice. But that's the practice of welcoming, just on a real basic level, is to see the thoughts that are arising, to recognize, what's happening. Oh, I'm irritated. I'm nervous. I'm planning ahead. To note that very gently, and then just to experience how that feels in the body, right? To soften around those feelings and to welcome them as well. then you actually get a sense of these fears, anxieties, irritations, really just kind of breezing through. There'll be a thought, there'll be some kind of emotional constriction around the thought. Constriction loosens and goes away. And then you're just back in the guest house again, waiting for the next thing. And if you've lived your whole life saying, oh, I'm an angry person or I'm a fearful person, and you experience that in your time of silence, you're like, oh, actually, I'm not an angry person. I was an angry person for 7 seconds or for 3 minutes. And then it went away. And then when I'm not that, I'm somebody else. Who is that somebody else? Right? So it starts to loosen up our self-images. And we learn slowly, slowly, slowly over many years that we too are beloved children, right? In whom God is well pleased. And if we could just be as well pleased with ourselves as God is with us, I think about 95% of our misery and suffering would disappear, and we'd be a lot more used to those around us. So the painting I included in you don't have to call it up, Holly, but I preached on that last week, but that's just another way of looking at the guest house. The scorpion in the palm. Holly was noting that Jesus's shoulders in that painting look a lot like the hills in the background. It's like hard to distinguish the rolling forms of the hills from the billowing of Jesus's tunic there. So there's kind of like a mountain-like solidity to Jesus as he's holding this apparently terrifying, scary, threatening thing, right? And that's the fruit of practicing welcome, right? Is that we experience a solidity in the face of the inevitable scorpions that will cross our paths, right? That ability just to be with whatever is there in love, and to see what is in front of us as our path to God. Okay. So you have permission to slam down coffee. I'm not going to stare at my Zoom screen while I pray. So the periods will be about half an hour. So that might be, again, a little bit more than you're used to, but good to sort of stretch and to be in that kind of place of non-familiarity, not knowing. And just play a little bit, throughout the morning with what happens when you actually just don't do anything. If you actually just surrendered and stop applying your technique, what happens? And just explore that.